Donald Trump was being dragged through courts. Many bloggers or meme makers being arrested and being sentenced in the United States. Riots in France. The police cracked down somewhat brutally against the protesters. But I don't think we have seen many people in the Western press write about the death of democracy in the West, a democratic backsliding in the West, intolerance. From around 2014, there has been what you might call a sustained and a relentless propaganda, I would say, against India in general and against the Modi government in particular. Not just nationalism, for an Indian to be a nationalist has become a pejorative word, but I think even the term Hindu has certain negative connotations. We have seen a certain rise in intensity of this anti-India propaganda, as I call it, ever since the Ukraine war starts. Just a couple of days ago, we saw the scenes from the United States where the former US President Donald Trump was arrested in a particular case. He was produced before the court. This was the first time in American history that a former president and the foremost contender in the next elections for the president, Donald Trump, was being dragged through courts in a case of somewhat dubious merit. But that's not the only thing which we've seen in the Western world. We've seen many bloggers or meme makers being arrested and being sentenced in the United States. We've seen scenes in the past from Canada where the truckers' strike was crushed. An emergency was imposed. We've seen riots in France. The police cracked down somewhat brutally against the protesters. But I don't think we have seen many people in the Western press write about the death of democracy in the West, a democratic backsliding in the West, intolerance or heavy-handed use of state machinery, misuse of the legal processes, etc., etc. All the familiar tropes which we hear when Western media talks about India. It could well be argued that many in the so-called liberal Western media is subservient to the government of the day. They are lapdogs of the governments in the Western countries, and that is why they just flow with whatever the government is doing and are never sharply critical of what is happening. Now again, this is precisely the kind of stuff which is said about Indian media, that why isn't it taking on the role of a political opposition to the government of the day. Now whenever somebody says that, well, the Indian media is independent in every manner possible, people have their choices, people have their own viewpoints, and that is how the Indian media operates. And then we are told that don't indulge in whataboutery. Now, this is a very interesting term which has been coined by people who do not want their hypocrisy to be pointed out. Now, every time you point somebody's hypocrisy out, they'll throw this whataboutery at you so that their hypocrisy is not reflected. I think the problem now is somewhat even deeper, because from around 2014 there has been what you might call a sustained and a relentless propaganda, I would say, against India in general and against the Modi government in particular. There is, of course, the usual stereotyping of the Modi government, which is right-wing Hindu nationalist. Now, sometimes these labels are used by Western media organizations to dumb things down for their audiences and to try and explain everything in a couple of words to their audiences. But I think there is something a little more sinister in what is underway, especially when it relates to the Modi government. In fact, when the right-wing Hindu nationalist term is used, it is used not as a description but as a pejorative. And in this particular case, not just nationalism, for an Indian to be a nationalist has become a pejorative word, but I think even the term Hindu has certain negative connotations attached to it as far as the Western media and the way they present it is concerned. Now, again, you will see that the Western media does not use these kind of phrases. For example, with the LDP in Japan, they will not say the same thing about the Christian Democrats in Germany or about parties in France or in other parts of the world. So why particularly in India? This has now started reaching some rather ridiculous levels. So for example, you had the great New York Times publish a story on saris, for example, and then attaching certain communal labels to the popularity of the sari in India. Saris have been worn by women in India for millennia, and yet suddenly some crazy guy gets up and he starts attaching a communal motive to the growing popularity of saris in India. You talk about infrastructure development or the digital economy in India, and you'll again come across Western media. Even when they write an article on this, they will have to add per force or by very nature this whole concept of Hindu nationalist government. What does a Hindu nationalist government have to do with a digital economy, a booming digital economy, or the inroads made in delivery of public services, or for that matter in infrastructure development? But yet these familiar tropes are used. Certain religious bias, unsaid, unstated, but it is very apparent. And mostly you will not see this among the old established Christian sects for that matter, but you will definitely see it among the evangelical Christians, especially in the United States, the Bible Belt as it's called. And there is a lot of anti-India propaganda coming from there, and this is being fed by some people who adhere to those particular religious denominations within India, and their representatives of the Western countries in India. This is reflected out there. You wonder whether you should even take Western media sources seriously anymore. And perhaps that is a bit of a problem in India because our media does not go in many other parts of the world to cover stories from an Indian lens, and we very often depend upon the Western media coverage to get our information, basic information. So I think that is one problem which very often comes about. The second problem with the Western media is that most of their journalists are these parachute journalists who know virtually nothing about India. They don't know the complexity of India, they don't know the culture of India, they don't know the various layers of the Indian social and political system, and very often their coverage it comes from their own particular background, their own specific backgrounds. And then when they come to India, they live in a kind of an echo chamber. They get their sources are part of that echo chamber. So all the inputs which they get is from that particular echo chamber, and their inability to process alternate viewpoints, alternate ways of thinking are quite apparent in the kind of drivel which is very often published in their newspapers. Now, so over the years what has started happening is that there is a certain negativity attached to India, and the general campaign against India is that this is a country where there has been a democratic backsliding, intolerance is on the rise, there is majoritarianism. The evidence presented is rather flimsy. For example, a huge furor was created over the Citizen Amendment Act, the CAA. And I can tell you that many journalists that we spoke to or who came to our foundation to speak on this matter, when we asked them whether they had even read this law, not one person had read the law. Forget understand it, they had not read the law. And the fact that similar laws have been passed in Western countries. Now, this law does not take away anybody's citizenship, and yet that is the narrative which was floated in the West. It does not, it only fast tracks citizenship for a certain section of people, persecuted religious minorities in India's neighborhood. Similar laws have been passed in Western countries, and yet when India does it, some grave miscarriage of justice or discrimination is taking place. When you ask Western journalists or Western policymakers that please give specific instances of injustices, there is very little coming. Because the fact of the matter is that when it concerns social welfare schemes, those are being evenly spread throughout society without any kind of discrimination. What I would call sanctimonious racism among the illiberal liberals of the Western media and the Western societies, who still think they are carrying some kind of white man's burden, where they are on some kind of a civilizing mission, where their sneering arrogance and their superciliousness comes pouring out when they think that they know how Indians must conduct their affairs, how Indians must dress, how Indians must eat, what Indians must eat, how Indians should vote, their voting preferences. Everything should be as per the worldview of these sanctimonious illiberal racists who actually pretend to be very liberal and very progressive elements in the West. So I think there is a huge problem coming from there. They even feel entitled to pronounce on the judicial processes and judicial verdicts in India. Again, let me take you back to what happened with Donald Trump. You ask anybody in India, and from most Indians' perspective, they will say this is a miscarriage of justice, this is victimization, this is hounding of an opposition leader. But that's not what you hear in among the liberal media in the West, who are all towing a particular line. And yet it is that same liberal media which feels entitled to comment on a particular case in India, where they will say that the death of democracy has happened because a certain political leader who did not contest the case as it should have been contested is convicted on defamation charges and is disqualified from parliament. Again, the fact that he gets relief from the same court is ignored. So it tells you about a certain bias in the Western media. We have seen a certain rise in intensity of this anti-India propaganda, as I call it, ever since the Ukraine war starts. And the position that India has taken hasn't exactly conformed to the position which most Western countries have taken. Like the Western countries do, the Indians are also looking after their own interests. And in some ways, I would even argue that India is also looking at the interests of the world. Now, just take this thing about India buying Russian oil. Now, if India was not to buy Russian oil, and if Russian oil was not to enter the oil markets of the world, what would happen to both oil prices and to oil supplies? So, should India sacrifice her economic well-being, economic well-being of our own citizens, simply because there is a fight between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and our friends in the West are siding with Ukraine and they don't want us to have any dealings with Russia? I think at least in Western governments there is even if a reluctant recognition of India doing what India should do. but not so much in the Western press, where there is this relentless propaganda continuing against the positions which India has taken. There is a certain communal element which also feeds into this narrative building against India, and I'm talking about organizations like the IAMC, the India American Muslim Society, Muslim Conference, or whatever that is. It's IAMC, and some of the other organizations, and then the people with whom, or their networks, if you will. But the thing is that some of this is also fed by people in India. There is this narrative building which has happened within India by what I would call the old entrenched elite classes, who suddenly see certain political changes taking place which are leaving them out in the cold, something which they can't handle anymore. Their networks are becoming ineffective. Their entitlement and their power and privilege is slipping away, and the one prong which they can think of on which they can try and recover some ground is to portray the current Indian government in very lurid colors, call it undemocratic, fascist, what have you, all those familiar terms which we have used, which we have seen being used against this particular government. So there is that element, and then of course the Western media's proclivity to only have writers write for them who conform to a certain particular worldview, and very often this worldview has to be anti-India, has to be anti a particular government, and that is then aired in the West, and then that entire narrative building is done. These people from India, they feed into the preconceived perceptions and conceptions of the so-called illiberal white folk, who ironically are also utterly intolerant of ideas which do not conform to their own, or which represent a kind of an alternate worldview. And I think one stark example of that is this growing cancel culture in Western societies. Now, these are people who probably think that they have a certain conception of what kind of an India they want to see, which is basically a somewhat dark-skinned clone of Western societies, or people like them. Now, the simple fact of the matter is India is not the West. Indians are not Americans, we are not British, we are not French, we are not Russians, we are not Chinese, we are not Germans, we are Indians. And we have our own history, we have our own culture, we have our own civilization, which has been a rather wounded and battered one, but which is rediscovering itself, which is rejuvenating, and perhaps even reasserting itself. And I think people in the West need to learn to deal with it, rather than rubbish it, rather than disparage it. They need to learn to deal with this India which is now rising. Does this mean that India is a perfect place? Far from it. India is no utopia, but then neither is the West. And if the idea is that you only want to pick up what Mahatma Gandhi once called, you only want to give what Mahatma Gandhi once called a drain inspector's report, then there are enough drains in the West which we can also use to report on them, and form our own image of Western societies. We tend to look at the positive aspects of Western societies and cultures and incorporate those. Unfortunately, what we see the Western media doing is only pick up the negative stereotypes about India and present it in rest of the world, and that is something which I think many Indians are getting a little sick of. I think their Western preachiness and their hectoring is getting rather tiresome. It is quite annoying and very offensive, especially because there is a huge gap between what the West says and what it claims to stand for, and how it practices things in real life, the kind of stuff which happens in Western societies, the kind of policies that Western countries follow, I think point out to the gap between what the West espouses and what the West practices. So I think there is a need, even in the West, to step back a little and understand that the world is not going to be a kind of a clone of Western societies, and the West needs to learn to live with that reality.